Hey there folks, Mr. Findlay here. This is just a short video on the process of sound design for theater. There are three basic uses of sound when it comes to theater. The first of them is the use of music. And music can fall into two categories, either transitional music or underscoring. Transitional music happens in between scenes. So if we're doing a set change from one set to another, we will often have a piece of music there. This also includes pre-show music that starts playing before the show, any music that plays during intermission, and even post-show music, or what we call exit music, that plays at the end of the show, or bow music. In all of these cases, this music is supposed to underscore the tone of the piece. So if you've got, say, a classical Shakespearean play set in the time of Shakespeare, maybe we hear some music of that period on actual period instruments to help us sort of feel in that time period. Or if you were writing a very sort of edgy, dark, modern piece like Bacchanal or a play like that, perhaps you would have something that was a bit harsher, a bit harder with electric guitars and that sort of thing. So interstitial music or transition music can help set the tone. And if the tone changes from scene to scene, that music can sort of help foreshadow that tone change as well. Underscoring does the same thing, but it does sort of even more overt way. Underscoring is music that plays during the scene. We see this constantly in movies. Virtually every scene in a movie is going to be underscored in some way, with music that lets us know that this is an anxious moment or this is a happy moment. In theater, underscoring is used less, but it can still be a very powerful tool. You always want to make sure when you're underscoring something, however, that it is a low enough sound that one, the actors can be heard over it, and two, it doesn't interrupt the action and distract from what the actors are saying. So that's the use of music. I suppose a third category would be in musicals where the characters are actually singing. In those cases, the sound designer doesn't choose the music. Instead, it's written into the show by the composer. But if you are running sound for a show, you still may need to work with that music. You may need to be running audio tracks, or you may need to be miking an orchestra. But the sound designer does not write the music for a musical necessarily. They would, however, come up with music, whether that's transitional music or underscoring, for non-musical plays. The second sort of category of sound design is what we call effects. And again, there are two categories within that. The first are sound effects, which we abbreviate as SFX. This is whenever something occurs that creates a sound that is not actually happening on stage. So for example, you may have a car horn honking. Now we're clearly not going to pull a car up backstage just to honk the horn. So instead we have the effect, a recorded sound of the car horn honking. This could be a gun going off or glass breaking, something that we want the audience to believe happened, and we're using sound to sell that illusion. Now, there are also practical sound effects, but the sound designer typically is not involved in these. So, for example, when we did All My Sons a few years ago, we wanted the gunshot sound that happens off stage to sound really realistic. We could have used a recorded sound, but it wouldn't have sounded as real because you would have heard the sound coming from the speakers rather than backstage. So we actually used a practical starter pistol for that gun effect to make sure that it was really clear and really realistic. Similarly, if you have a dog barking off stage, you may not want a real dog, you want a recorded one. However, if, as in some plays, there's actually a dog on stage and that's part of the scripted action, you don't also need additional recorded sounds. Any sound that is produced on stage, real, it's called a practical sound effect, does not need to be recorded as well. The other type of sound effects are what we call ambient sounds. And this is where a sound designer can get really creative with creating a sense of place through the background sounds. If you're out in the middle of the Antarctic on an ice floe, for example, The wind is a constant presence. And so if you have a play set in Antarctica, a low-level wind sound may be playing throughout the entire piece. Or if you have a piece set in a busy train station, the sound of people moving in the background and trains coming in and out and announcements, all of that goes to create what we call a soundscape. That is sort of like a backdrop made of sound. This is where a sound designer can be really creative with what they are doing. The third category of sound is what we call reinforcement. And this is taking existing practical sounds, primarily the sounds of voices, and making sure that they can be heard throughout the entire auditorium. This involves microphones. And there's many different types of microphones. You have what are called chorus mics that hang from the grid and cover a big area. You have floor mics that go on the floor and also cover a big area. This is if you need to pick up lots of people singing, or if you are, trying to, instead of miking individual people, just get a general wash of sound. There are also individual mics. Typically, we will use wireless mics I'll have a whole separate video on those, but they have a transmitter that goes on the costume and a mic piece that usually comes over the ear, which transmits to a receiver at the soundboard. With a big Broadway musical, think of Hamilton, for example, the whole cast of Hamilton, I think it's a cast of about 18, every single person is mic'd. There are no area mics, so everyone is mic'd, and then the sound operator has a very specific job of balancing all the sounds of all of those different 18 mics to make sure that we hear the chorus, but we hear the leads on top of that. So it's going to be a very complicated process. It's not just a matter of sticking the mic on someone, but also figuring out what are the levels of that mic. We'll talk about that all in the sound process video, because it's a fairly complicated thing. Some other just terms you ought to know in the design of sound. We talk about frequency or pitch. This is literally, it's how fast the sound wave is vibrating, how tight those waves are. That is the relative highness or lowness of the sound. There is also the intensity. This is something that you're going to be dealing with a lot, very hands-on. This is the volume of the sound. It's measured in decibels and is adjusted via the board. We also refer to something as the timbre or the resonance of the sound. Right now, if you hear my voice, besides just the pitch of the voice and the loudness, you can hear I have a very stuffed up nose right now, right? That is affecting the timbre, the resonance of the sound. It's making it sound a little bit muffled. Different instruments, different actors have different resonances, and that's something that you will want to keep in mind as you are miking them. And there are adjustments that can be made on the board to adjust for those to make sure everyone is clear no matter what the resonance of their sound is. We'll talk about that actually with Ms. Cooper, since she is our resident sorceress when it comes to sound. So the process for sound design is the same as any other design process. You'll meet with the director in a production meeting. You'll get a sense of the design metaphor. You'll go forth and research the play, the period, figure out what sorts of sounds would be necessary. Certainly reading the script, because often in the script there will be certain sound effects that are called for in the script, whether that's the gunshot off stage or the dog barking. And so there's a lot of research. And then the first document that's created is the sound plot, which is a list of all the various scenes and the sound effects in them, as well as the music that might be in them as well. Then that sound plot, once you have that, then you can begin actually pulling those sounds, pulling those pieces of music, pulling those sound effects. In some cases, you'll need to make a sound effect. You'll need to actually record it live. A person who works specifically in the making of sound effects is called a Foley artist, and they will create specific sound effects for shows. They'll have a Foley studio is full of like sandbags and broken glass and gravel and all these and various mics, so you can record different types of sound effects. We may occasionally do some Foley work here and record our own sound effects. More often, you're going to find existing ones online, which can be purchased typically fairly cheaply within the sound budget. The sound budget usually doesn't go so much to the buying of music and sound effects as it does to getting microphones, which are quite expensive. And that is the next part of the process. Not every show, certainly at RTH, requires mics. Um, but shows that do, that's another whole part of the system. And so some terminology you should just be aware of as we get into that. We'll show you how the mic system gets set up in the process video, but just so you know the terminology. A microphone, of course, is, or we sometimes call it a mic, is an item, whether that's handheld or goes over the ear, that picks up sound and then transmit that sound either via cable or wirelessly to a receiver, which then goes into the board. The board typically has all of the inputs for the sound as well as an equalizer. An equalizer are a series of sliders that allow us to adjust the relative volume of each of the inputs so that they are balanced, so that the audience hears what they need to hear at any given moment. From the board, that signal runs out to an amplifier, or we call it an amp, which then boosts the signal, and it runs then from the amp into the actual speakers. These speakers sometimes are built in. We have pendant speakers that are built into the grid that were actually part of the building when we moved in. There are also cabinet speakers, what we call cabs, which can be moved around if we want the sound coming from different places. So that's just a brief overview of the steps of the sound design process, as well as some of the terminology that you'll need as you start building these sound systems.